Those of you who have gone through the experience can testify to the truth of the statement, having a baby changes your life. In fact, you might say that's quite an understatement. A while back there was an ad on television for a car company. I think it was Volkswagen. And in the first scene, you see this adolescent boy looking longingly at a new bike for purchase and asking, "Is it fast?" Then the second scene, same boy, only now a few years older, looking at a sports car to buy and asking, "Is it fast?" And in the final scene, this same guy, now appearing to be in his mid to late 20s, carrying a baby on his chest in one of those harnesses, looking at a Volkswagen Jetta, he says, "But is it safe?" Yes, without a doubt, a baby changes your life. Imagine approaching your 100th birthday, hearing the news that you are going to have a baby. What must Sarah have been thinking? Are you crazy, God? It seems an outlandish promise. And it might be passed off as Abraham being delusional, maybe signs of Alzheimer's setting in, if it were not for the fact that this promise is based on a long-standing promise that God had made to this man over many years, that he and his childless wife Sarah would one day be the ancestors of many nations. Abraham, or Abram as he was first named, had a history of living according to God's promises. For many years, Abram had hung his life upon God's promises. After all, it was Abram who had packed up his wife and children and livestock, and he had left a very familiar and comfortable life in a place called Ur of Chaldees to pursue a life in a promised land somewhere, someplace he had never been before. I'm always amazed when I hear stories of folks who wake up one day and they make a dramatic change in the direction of their lives, all because they sense this calling that God wants them to do it. In college, I had a friend, a Lutheran preacher's daughter. Her father had been in the middle of a successful executive level career with the Sears and Roebuck Company in Chicago. And one day he comes home to announce to his wife and children that God is calling him into the ministry, and that he thought he needed to quit his job and go to seminary and follow God's call. His wife is like, "Oh yeah?" Over the years, I've met others who had similar stories of being called into ministry in the midpoint of their career lives, and I always feel for the spouses who may not have signed on for this life in the ministry when the very marriage vows were made. Jean knew exactly what she was getting into. Who had signed on when they said for better or worse, or in the case of ministry, for richer or for poor. Abram gets the word from God that the promise will be fulfilled, that a baby's on its way, and that this baby will change their lives. So much so that Abram needs a new name. In an article entitled "How Abe Became a Ham," did you get that? A blogger named Tim, who describes himself as a lay speaker, poet, photographer, and tree hugger, says that promise, that famous promise God gave Abraham, that he and his children would possess the earth, was not given because of something Abraham did or would do. It was based on God's decision to put it all together for him, which Abraham then entered into that decision when he believed, when he had faith. If those who get what God gives them only by doing everything they're told to do and filling out all the right forms properly signed, well, that eliminates personal trust completely and turns the promise into an ironclad contract. That's not a holy promise. That's a business deal. A contract drawn up by a hard-nosed lawyer with plenty of fine print only makes sure that you will never be able to collect. But if there's no contract in the first place, simply a promise, and God's promise, then it can't be broken. This is why the fulfillment of God's promise depends entirely on trusting God and his way, and then simply embracing God and what he does. For God's promise always arrives to us as a pure gift. That's the only way any one of us can ever be sure to get in on God's promises. Those who keep the religious traditions, those who do what they're supposed to do, and those who don't, and those who've never even heard of it. For Abraham is the father of us all. He's not our racial father. That's reading the story backward. He's our faith father. We call Abraham father not because he got God's attention by living like a saint, but because God had made something out of Abraham when Abraham was a nobody. And isn't that what Scripture says to us over and again? When God says to Abraham, I set you up. I did this as a father of many peoples. Abraham was first named father before he became a father, because he dared to trust God and what God could do. The God who could raise the dead to life. The God who with a word could make something out of nothing. When everything was hopeless, what did Abraham do? He believed anyway. Deciding to live not on the basis of what he saw he couldn't do, but on the basis of what God said he could do. And so Abraham was made father of a multitude of peoples. God himself said to him, Abraham, you are going to have one big thing. Abraham, do you notice, did not focus on his own impotence. And he did not say, well, God, this is a hopeless situation. This 100-year-old body could never father a child. Nor did he survey his wife Sarah and her decades of infertility and say, this is impossible. Abraham didn't tiptoe around God's promise, asking cautiously skeptical questions. Rather, he plunged right into that promise and he came up strong, ready for God, sure that God would make good on what God had said. And that's why it is said Abraham was declared fit before God, because he trusted God to set things right. But it's not just Abraham. It's also us. The same thing gets said about us when we embrace and believe that the one who brought Jesus to life when the conditions were equally hopeless, when that sacrifice Jesus is believed in and trusted, then we're made fit for God. We're set right. So, it can be a radical thing, right? A countercultural thing, and everybody thinks I'm a little bit crazy thing, to say I'm going to shape my life around God's promises. God's promises. You know, it's not instinctive within us to do that, is it? For most of us seem to naturally gravitate toward self-preservation and self-protection and self-advancement, self. And the idea that we would reorient our whole lives, that we would shift our life priorities away from self to trusting God, well, that's incredibly difficult. That's why in the gospel reading for today that Kylie referenced earlier, Jesus comes across as so impatient and almost harsh with Peter when Peter doesn't want to hear Jesus talking about suffering and sacrifice leading to death on a cross. You remember what Jesus called Peter? What did he call him? He called him the devil, didn't he? He said, Peter, get behind me, Satan. The only time I believe in all the scriptures Jesus ever pins that name on anybody. Jesus knows that the evil one's most powerful tool is that overwhelming impulse to distrust God and to go the easier route and the wider pathway, looking out for who? Himself. For number one, right? And in that frame of mind and in that value system, Jesus' words that in order to save one's life, one must be willing to lose one's life. Well, that seems a little bit crazy. I agree with the commentator, John Stutler, who said, faith is believing in God's ability to keep a promise. Faith for Abraham was living in the light of God's promises. No matter what the outward circumstances were, Abraham trusted the larger picture that God had given to him in the promise of nations yet to come. So what's the larger picture for us? What does God have? What has God promised us? There's a reason you and I are here this morning. Do you believe that? You know, we could be a lot of other places today. We could be using our morning to catch up from the week before. For some of us, we could be relaxing at home, doing a favorite recreational activity. Some of us could be out and be doing, something that's recreational. We could be in a different worship place this morning. Lots of choices out there. We could go somewhere with better facilities, different side of town, maybe more people, more programs. But we're here. We're here. For I believe God has called us here. I know He's called me here. But I also believe that in the fulfillment of His promises, He also called you here. For there's work to be done right here. The kingdom work is to be done, needs to be done right here. Individuals and families living right here within the stone's throw, within the shadow of this very building. Folks who are hopeless and who need someone to witness to them of God's love and mercy and forgiveness. And the belief that you can start over. Within the very shadow of this church are folks who need to know that God will make a way where there seems to be no way. That God will make something out of nothing. That God will give us hope when all seems to be lost. I remember so well when the idea was first put out about reopening this church building on this side of town. I'll admit, my first response was not, oh, great. That sounds like a grand idea. But I listened. I remember we had the first meeting here about opening this church. A few of you were here. And it wasn't just within a few days after that first meeting. I came back down here to this building and windows had been broken and doors busted in. And then there was a few things gone, and then a few more weeks passed and came back down here again, and there was a few more things gone. The electrical was now ripped out of the building. Piping was gone. I think there were about 7 different times in visiting this building, I had to call the police to say we've had another break. And so all that was here was a building that was not in too good of shape. It had been, but it wasn't anymore. And there was an impulse in me that said, okay, do I really want to commit my life to a place where that sort of thing happens on a regular basis? But then God's promises just kept being fulfilled all around. something inside me says, this is not my doing. This is a God thing. This is a God thing. God's going to make this happen. It's not up to me whether I'm a part of it or not. God's going to make this happen. And then you all came. And it happened. That's what God can do not only for us together, but for each and every one of you in your own journey. You know, we have learned here over these last 3.5, almost 4 years, that there's some huge obstacles out there in life. And many of you are facing those obstacles on a day-by-day basis. Obstacles that some of us who've never confronted those obstacles don't know firsthand. But we're learning. And we know that those obstacles can make you believe that there is no way forward. That there is no hope to have. But God is here. He's here. Do you believe that? He's here to say, where there is no way, I'm making a way. Where there is no hope, I'm giving hope. Turn to someone around you today and say, where there is no way, God is making a way. A baby at 100. That's a way. Who knows what not? Let's pray. For your promise made to us through your servant, our father Abraham, we give you thanks this day. And even though that promise was first spoken and lived and followed centuries upon centuries ago, that promise which revealed that you always can make a way is still very much alive here among us today. Who knows what you're going to do here? Who knows what sort of transformation is taking place, like seeds germinating in the early spring soil? Who knows what's going to happen right here in our very midst? Not because of me or any one of us, but because of you, Lord. You who always keep